People betrayed him. Frozen German Shepherd sat in the rain, ready to give up. Cold rain poured relentlessly from the slate-gray sky, the drops heavy and icy as they splattered against the cracked pavement. The wind howled through the narrow streets, sending shivers through the ancient oak trees that lined the sidewalk, their branches swaying like skeletal fingers reaching for the heavens. In the middle of this bleak, unforgiving storm sat a lone figure, motionless and defeated. His fur, once thick and majestic, was now soaked and clinging to his thin, trembling body. Mud caked his paws and his tail lay limp in the puddle beneath him, the water slowly rising and pooling around his frail form. His name was Ranger, and he was waiting. He had been waiting for what felt like an eternity, his eyes fixed on the chipped red door of the small house that stood just a few yards away. It was the place he once called home. His ears twitched at the slightest sound, but the only noise that reached him was the rhythmic patter of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Every so often, a car would splash by, headlights flashing across his hollow eyes, but no one stopped. No one seemed to notice the broken, abandoned creatures shivering in the cold. They were just shadows speeding past, too preoccupied to care. Ranger's once golden-brown coat was now a dull, matted mess, tangled with leaves and grime. His ribs protruded beneath his soaked fur, each breath a visible struggle. He curled in on himself, trying to preserve the last bit of warmth that lingered in his frail body, but the cold seeped in deeper, biting at his skin and numbing his paws. Yet he stayed. He stayed because he believed that Daniel would come back. Daniel, the man who had loved him, cared for him, and played with him in the sunlit yard behind that very door. Ranger's eyes flicked to the window, just as he had done 1,000 times before, hoping to see his owner's face smiling down at him. But the window remained empty, the house dark and silent. The world around him seemed to echo his loneliness. He remembered the day Daniel left, how sudden it had been. There was no warning, no goodbye, just flashing lights and voices that spoke in urgent, hushed tones. Men in uniforms had rushed into the house, carrying Daniel out on a stretcher, his face pale and his eyes closed. Ranger had barked, tried to follow, but the door had slammed shut, leaving him outside, confused and scared. Days passed, then weeks. Neighbors came and went, some glancing his way but never stopping. They assumed he was a stray, a nobody. The once full food bowl on the porch had been knocked over by the wind, its contents washed away by the endless rain. Hunger gnawed at him, but Ranger didn't leave. He couldn't. This was home. This was where Daniel would find him when he came back. Ranger's head drooped, his ears flattening against his skull, as another gust of wind howled through the street, whipping cold droplets into his face. His body shuddered, every muscle aching from the cold and the dampness that had seeped into his bones. But the pain didn't matter. Nothing mattered, except waiting. He was Daniel's dog. Loyal, faithful. Ranger wouldn't give up. Not yet. His eyes grew heavy, the exhaustion pressing down on him like a weight he could no longer bear. He wanted to sleep, to close his eyes and forget the biting cold, the hunger, and the aching loneliness that gnawed at his heart. But he fought to stay awake, forcing his eyes to remain on the door, just in case. Just in case Daniel came back. Shadows danced along the pavement as the streetlight flickered, a ghostly glow that seemed to mock his hope. Another night was passing, another night alone. Ranger's breath came out in shallow puffs of white mist, his body growing still as the cold wrapped around him, a cruel embrace that refused to let go. His vision blurred, and the world around him began to fade into a swirling haze of gray and black. But before the darkness could take him, a sound broke through the rain, a distant hum, low and steady, growing louder by the second. Headlights appeared at the end of the street, piercing through the downpour, their beams reflecting off the wet pavement. The car moved slowly, cautiously, its wipers working furiously to clear the windshield. Ranger's ears perked up, his body tensing as he watched the vehicle approach. His heart thudded weakly in his chest, hope flaring up like a dying ember, catching a stray breeze. Was it Daniel? Had he finally come back? The car slowed as it neared the house, its tires splashing through puddles. Ranger's eyes widened, his body trembling with anticipation. He tried to stand, but his legs wobbled beneath him, too weak to support his weight. He collapsed back into the mud, whimpering softly, his eyes never leaving the car. It stopped just a few feet away, the engine humming quietly as the rain continued to beat against its metal roof. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out, pulling a hood over their head to shield from the rain. It was not Daniel. It was a woman, her silhouette illuminated by the streetlight as she stood by the car, looking towards the house. Ranger's heart sank, the hope extinguished as quickly as it had ignited. He let out a low whine, his body curling in on itself once more. But the woman didn't leave. She took a step forward, her gaze shifting from the house to the small, trembling figure lying in the mud. Her eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized what she was seeing. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice carrying over the rain. She took another step, then another, her movements slow and cautious. Ranger watched her, his body tense, unsure of whether to be afraid or relieved. She knelt down, her face softening as she took in his hollow eyes and frail body. "Hey there. What happened to you?" she murmured, her voice gentle and warm. Ranger's ears twitched, his eyes locked on hers, searching for any sign of cruelty. But all he saw was kindness, a softness that seemed foreign and unfamiliar after so many days of cold indifference. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against his wet fur, and Ranger flinched, his body instinctively recoiling. But she didn't pull away. She stayed there, her hand hovering just inches from his face, her eyes filled with sadness. "It's okay. I won't hurt you," she whispered. Her voice was soft, steady, like Daniel's had been. Ranger's body relaxed, his eyes never leaving hers as he took a shuddering breath. For the first time in what felt like forever, warmth began to spread through his chest, a flicker of hope reigniting in his weary heart. The rain continued to fall, but the world no longer felt so cold. Emily's heart broke as she looked at the pitiful creature before her. The German shepherd's body was skeletal, his fur matted and soaked through, clinging to his fragile frame. His eyes, hollow and sunken, held a look of such profound sadness that it took her breath away. She had never seen a dog so defeated, so utterly without hope. Yet as she crouched beside him in the pouring rain, she saw a flicker of something else, a tiny spark of trust, hesitant and frail, but unmistakable. She couldn't leave him here. Not like this. "Hey, buddy. You're okay now." "I've got you," she whispered, her voice trembling as she fought back tears. She moved slowly, careful not to startle him, her hand reaching out to gently stroke his head. His body stiffened at the touch, his muscles tightening as if expecting pain. But when none came, his shoulders relaxed and his head dipped, his eyes drifting shut as he leaned into her palm, just for a moment. Emily's heart squeezed at the gesture, so small yet filled with such a desperate need for comfort. She glanced at her car, the headlights casting long shadows across the wet pavement, then back at the dog who lay motionless in the mud, too weak to stand. He would die out here if she left him. She knew it as surely as she knew her own name. Without another thought, she slid her arms under his body, gasping at how light he was. His ribs pressed sharply against her skin, his frame alarmingly delicate beneath the layers of sodden fur. "Oh God, you're freezing," she murmured, cradling him against her chest as she rose to her feet. His body trembled violently, his head lolling limply over her arm, but he didn't resist. He was too exhausted, too broken to fight. The rain pelted her as she hurried back to her car, her boots splashing through puddles that seemed to reach up and grab at her ankles. She yanked the back door open and gently laid him on the seat, quickly draping an old blanket over his shivering form. "Stay with me, okay? Just hold on a little longer," she whispered, brushing wet hair from her face as she climbed into the driver's seat. She cranked up the heater, glancing over her shoulder to see him curled in a tight ball, his eyes squeezed shut as his body shook uncontrollably. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as she fought to keep her voice steady. "You're safe now. I promise." The engine roared to life, and she pulled away from the curb, her heart pounding as she drove through the rain-slicked streets. Her eyes kept drifting to the rearview mirror, where the dog lay motionless, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. She didn't know who he belonged to, how he had ended up in such a terrible state, or why no one had bothered to help him. But she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let him die, not when she could do something to save him. As she drove, her mind raced with questions. Where had he come from? How long had he been waiting in the rain, alone and afraid? Her chest tightened at the thought of him sitting out there, watching the door of that house, waiting for someone who never came. Who could do something so cruel? Who could abandon a creature so loyal, so trusting, and leave him to suffer? The thought filled her with anger, hot and bitter, but she pushed it away. There would be time for answers later. Right now he needed help, and she was his only chance. The journey felt like an eternity, every second stretching painfully as she fought to keep her focus on the road. Rain lashed against the windshield, the wipers working furiously to clear her view, but her eyes kept flicking to the mirror, her heart skipping a beat each time his body shuddered with cold. "Just hold on. We're almost there," she murmured, her voice trembling. When she finally pulled into her driveway, relief washed over her, and she threw the car into park, leaping out and rushing to the back seat. The dog hadn't moved. He lay curled under the blanket, his breathing shallow, his body limp. Panic surged through her, and she placed a trembling hand on his chest, feeling the faint rise and fall beneath her palm. "You're okay. You're still here," she whispered, blinking back tears as she gently scooped him into her arms once more. His head lolled against her shoulder, his fur damp and cold against her neck. She could feel his heartbeat, weak and fluttering, and she held him closer, her own heart thudding in her chest. The rain pounded down as she ran to her front door, fumbling with the keys before finally shoving it open. Warmth enveloped them as she stumbled inside, kicking the door shut behind her. She hurried to the living room, carefully laying him on the couch and wrapping him in a thick, dry blanket. His body shivered violently, his eyes barely opening before sliding shut once more. "No, no, you need to stay with me," she pleaded, her hands working quickly to dry his fur, rubbing his legs to stimulate circulation. She ran to the bathroom, returning with a towel and a heating pad, tucking it beneath him as she continued to whisper words of comfort. His breathing was shallow, his body trembling uncontrollably, but she refused to give up. "Come on, buddy, our fight. Don't leave me now," she begged, tears spilling over as she stroked his head, her fingers brushing over his matted fur. Time blurred as she worked, her hands moving mechanically as fear gripped her heart. She didn't know how long she sat there, praying, pleading, willing him to live. But then, as the storm outside began to ease, a soft sound broke through the silence, a faint whimper, fragile and weak, but unmistakable. Her breath caught, her eyes locking on his face as his eyelids fluttered, his chest rising just a little bit stronger than before. "That's it. That's it. You're okay," she choked, her hand cradling his head as his eyes opened, just a sliver, and looked up at her. They were filled with pain, with exhaustion, but also with something she hadn't seen before. Hope. Her heart swelled, a sob breaking free as she smiled through her tears. "You're safe now. I won't leave you, I promise." His eyes flickered, his body relaxing as his head sank into her palm, and for the first time since she found him, his tail moved, just the slightest wag, but enough to break her heart all over again. The room was warm and quiet, the soft hum of the heater filling the air as Emily sat curled beside the couch, her eyes never leaving the German shepherd's fragile form. His body was still trembling beneath the thick blanket, his breath shallow and uneven, but the violent shivers had lessened, his muscles slowly relaxing as the warmth seeped into his cold, aching bones. Emily's fingers stroked his head gently, her touch feather-light as she whispered words of comfort, her voice low and soothing. "You're safe now. You're going to be okay," she murmured, her heart aching as his eyes fluttered open, dull and unfocused, before drifting shut again. He was exhausted, his body fighting to hold on after days, maybe weeks, of suffering. She couldn't imagine the pain he must have endured, alone and abandoned in the freezing rain. The thought made her chest tighten, anger flaring as she glanced at his thin frame, the sharp outline of his ribs visible beneath his matted fur. How could anyone do this? How could they leave him to die without a second thought? But she forced herself to push the anger away. There would be time for questions later. Right now, he needed her. He needed hope. Rising to her feet, Emily moved quickly to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she filled a bowl with lukewarm water, careful not to make it too cold or too hot. She grabbed a clean cloth, her eyes flicking back to the living room, where the dog lay motionless on the couch, his body curled tightly as if trying to protect himself from an unseen threat. Her heart broke all over again as she watched his chest rise and fall, each breath a fragile whisper. He looked so small, so vulnerable. She knew he was lucky to be alive, but she also knew his fight was far from over. Returning to his side, she knelt beside the couch, dipping the cloth into the warm water and gently dabbing at his face, cleaning away the dirt and grime that clung to his fur. He flinched at the touch, a low whimper escaping his throat as his eyes flickered open, wide and fearful. Emily froze, her heart aching at the panic she saw there. "Hey, it's okay," she whispered, her voice soft and steady. "I won't hurt you. I promise." His body remained tense, his muscles rigid beneath her hand, but his eyes never left hers, searching her face for any sign of danger. She stayed perfectly still, her gaze locked on his as she offered a small, gentle smile. "You're safe now. I've got you." Something in her voice seemed to reach him, and his eyes softened, his body sinking deeper into the cushions as the fear slowly drained away. Emily let out a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing as she continued to clean his fur, her movements slow and deliberate, giving him time to adjust to her presence. As she worked, she spoke to him, her words a quiet, soothing murmur meant to calm his racing heart. "You're a strong boy. I can see that," she said, her fingers gently brushing over his tangled fur. "You didn't give up, even when things got tough. You're a fighter." His ears twitched at the sound of her voice, his eyes following her as she moved around him, her touch light and careful. She wondered what he was thinking, if he understood her words, if he could feel the love and compassion she was pouring into every movement. She hoped he did. She hoped he could feel that he wasn't alone anymore, that someone cared. When she finished cleaning his face, Emily reached for the bowl of water, holding it close to his nose. "Here, you must be thirsty," she said softly, tipping the bowl just enough for him to reach. He hesitated, his eyes flicking between the water and her face, uncertainty flickering in his gaze. But his thirst won out, and he leaned forward, his tongue flicking out to lap at the water. Emily's heart swelled with relief, tears pricking at her eyes as she watched him drink, his body trembling with each shaky breath. It was a small victory, but it was enough to give her hope. When he finished, his head drooped, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Emily placed the bowl on the floor and gently tucked the blanket around him, her hand lingering on his head as she stroked his ears. "Get some rest. I'll be right here," she whispered, her voice cracking as she fought to keep her emotions in check. He let out a soft sigh, his body curling into the warmth as his eyes drifted shut, his breathing evening out as sleep finally claimed him. Emily sank to the floor, her back against the couch as she watched over him, her heart aching at the sight of his frail body lying so still and quiet. She wondered how long he had been out there, waiting in the cold, abandoned and alone. She wondered how many nights he had spent shivering in the rain, his eyes fixed on that empty house, hoping for someone who never came. Tears slipped down her cheeks, her chest tightening as she imagined the pain he must have felt, the heartbreak of being left behind. She reached out, her fingers brushing over his matted fur as she made a silent promise. "You won't be alone anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the heater. "I'll take care of you, no matter what." As the night wore on, Emily stayed by his side, her eyes never leaving his face as he slept, his body finally at peace. The storm outside had passed, the rain easing into a gentle drizzle, the world quiet and still. But inside, warmth and hope filled the room, wrapping around them both as they faced the long road ahead. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring or how much time he had left, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let him face it alone. Not now. Not ever. Morning light filtered softly through the curtains, bathing the room in a golden glow as Emily stirred awake, her back stiff from sleeping on the floor. She blinked groggily, the events of the previous night flooding back to her in a rush. The rain, the shivering dog, the desperate race to save his life. Her eyes snapped to the couch, her heart pounding as she looked for any sign of movement. Relief washed over her as she saw the slow rise and fall of his chest, his body still curled beneath the thick blanket. He was alive, exhausted, frail, and heartbreakingly vulnerable, but alive. She let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging as the tension left her body. He had made it through the night. That was more than she had dared to hope for. Carefully, she pushed herself to her feet, her muscles protesting from hours spent on the hard floor. She moved quietly, not wanting to disturb him, as she padded to the kitchen, her mind already racing with the list of things she needed to do. Food. He would need something easy to digest, something gentle on his stomach after who knew how long without a proper meal. She rummaged through her pantry, her fingers closing around a can of chicken broth, the warmth of hope blooming in her chest. He had drunk water last night. That was a good sign. Maybe he would be strong enough to eat today. She heated the broth on the stove, the aroma filling the air as she poured it into a shallow bowl, testing the temperature with her fingertip before carrying it back to the living room. The German Shepherd hadn't moved, his body still curled into a tight ball, his head resting limply on the cushion. Emily's heart clenched at the sight, his fragile frame looking so small, so breakable against the plush couch. She knelt beside him, setting the bowl on the floor as she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his head. His fur was softer now, the dirt and grime washed away, but he was still far too thin, his ribs pressing sharply against his skin. "Hey, good morning, sleepyhead," she whispered, her voice gentle as she stroked his ear. "I brought you something to eat. Think you can try a little for me?" His eyelids fluttered, a low whimper escaping his throat as his eyes opened, unfocused and glassy. Emily's breath caught, her hands stilling as he blinked slowly, his gaze drifting until it settled on her face. There was fear there, uncertainty and pain, but also a flicker of recognition. He remembered her. The realization brought tears to her eyes and she swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. He needed her to be strong, to be steady. "You're safe." "I won't hurt you," she murmured, keeping her voice soft and soothing. "I just want to help." His eyes remained locked on hers, his body tense and wary, but he didn't pull away. Encouraged, Emily reached for the bowl of broth, holding it close to his nose so he could smell the warm, savory scent. His nostrils flared, his tongue flicking out to taste the air, but he made no move to drink. "Come on, just a little," she coaxed, her heart aching as she watched him struggle, his body too weak to even lift his head. She slid her arm under his neck, lifting him gently so his head rested in the crook of her elbow, his nose just inches from the bowl. "There you go. That's it," she whispered, her fingers stroking his fur as she held him steady. His eyes flicked to hers, a silent question reflected in their depths, and she smiled softly, her heart breaking at the vulnerability she saw there. "It's okay. You can trust me." His gaze lingered on her face, searching, evaluating, before finally dipping to the bowl. His tongue darted out hesitantly, lapping at the warm broth, his body trembling as he swallowed. Emily's chest tightened, a tear slipping down her cheek as he took another sip, then another, his movements slow and shaky but determined. "That's it. Good boy," she choked, her voice thick with emotion. "You're doing so good." He finished half the bowl before his head sagged against her arm, his energy spent. Emily eased him back down onto the cushion, tucking the blanket around him as his eyes drifted shut, his breathing deep and even. She watched him sleep, her hand resting on his head as she marveled at his resilience, his will to survive. After everything he had been through, he was still fighting. He hadn't given up, and she wouldn't give up on him either. She stayed by his side for hours, watching his chest rise and fall, memorizing the soft curve of his nose, the delicate flutter of his eyelashes. He was beautiful, even in his brokenness. his spirit shining through despite the pain and suffering he had endured. She wondered who had left him, who had looked into those soulful eyes and decided he wasn't worth saving. The thought made her chest tighten with anger, her fist clenching as she fought the urge to scream. How could anyone be so heartless? But she forced herself to breathe, to let go of the anger and focus on what mattered. He was here, and he needed her. The rest could wait. As evening approached, Emily's exhaustion began to catch up with her, her body heavy with fatigue. But just as she began to nod off, a soft sound broke through the quiet. A whimper, weak and pitiful, filled with fear. Her eyes flew open, her heart pounding as she saw his body tremble, his legs twitching as if trying to run. His head thrashed weakly, his eyes squeezed shut, his breathing rapid and uneven. He was dreaming, but not the peaceful kind. No, he was reliving a nightmare, trapped in the darkness of his memories. Emily's throat tightened as she reached out, her hand resting on his head, her fingers stroking his fur in slow, soothing circles. "Shh, it's okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're safe. Nothing can hurt you now." His body shuddered, his whimpers growing louder, his paws scraping against the cushion as he struggled. Emily's heart broke, tears slipping down her cheeks as she continued to whisper, her voice a gentle melody meant to bring him back. "I've got you. I won't let anything hurt you," she murmured, her fingers cradling his head as she rocked him gently, her love wrapping around him like a blanket. Slowly his thrashing eased, his body relaxing as his breathing steadied, his whimpers fading into soft sighs. His eyes fluttered open, dazed and unfocused, and Emily's heart clenched as he looked up at her, his gaze filled with confusion and fear. But then his eyes softened, his body sinking into her touch, and his head fell against her hand, his trust complete and unconditional. "That's it. You're okay," she choked, her tears falling freely as she held him close. "I'm right here. I won't leave you. I promise." And for the first time, his eyes closed, not in fear, but in peace, his body curling into her lap as he drifted back to sleep, his breathing slow and steady, his heart finally at rest. Days passed in a blur of routine and quiet vigilance. Emily cared for the German shepherd with a tenderness she hadn't known she was capable of, her heart breaking a little more each time she saw his fragile body curled beneath the blanket. She named him Ranger, a strong name for a dog who had survived so much, who had fought through pain and hunger and loneliness, yet still clung to life with every ounce of strength he had left. Every morning she would kneel by his side, coaxing him to drink lukewarm water and spoon-feeding him gentle broths to rebuild his strength. At first he resisted, his eyes wary and haunted, his body tense with fear. But Emily never pushed, never forced him. She simply sat with him, her voice a soft, steady murmur, as she whispered words of comfort, her fingers brushing over his head in slow rhythmic strokes. Little by little, his defenses began to crumble. He started to trust her, his eyes lingering on her face a little longer, his body relaxing beneath her touch. And then, one morning, he did something that made Emily's breath catch in her throat. He licked her hand, just once, his tongue flicking out to graze her palm before his head dropped back to the cushion, his eyes drifting shut as if exhausted by the effort. It was a tiny gesture, but to Emily it was everything. Tears filled her eyes, her chest tightening as she pressed her forehead to his, her voice trembling. "You're safe now, Ranger. I promise." From that moment on, a bond began to grow between them, fragile but unbreakable, woven together by whispered promises and shared pain. Ranger watched her every move, his eyes tracking her as she moved about the room, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice. He still slept most of the day, his body weak and frail, but his spirit was slowly returning, flickers of curiosity shining in his eyes as he began to explore his surroundings. One afternoon, Emily caught him watching the birds outside the window, his head tilting to the side as they fluttered past. A tiny smile curved her lips, hope swelling in her chest as she realized he was starting to remember what it felt like to live. But the nights were still hard. Ranger's nightmares continued, haunting him with memories she couldn't see, battles she couldn't fight. He would cry out in his sleep, his body trembling, his paws twitching as he ran from unseen monsters. Emily would wake to his whimpers, her heart aching as she gathered him in her arms, holding him close and rocking him back and forth as she whispered to him, her voice a lullaby meant to chase away the darkness. "You're safe. I've got you. Nothing can hurt you now," she would murmur over and over again until his cries faded, his body relaxing as he drifted back into a peaceful sleep. It broke her heart to see him so vulnerable, to know that someone had hurt him so deeply that even his dreams were filled with fear. She wondered who he had belonged to, who had looked into those soulful eyes and decided he wasn't worth loving. But she never asked the neighbors, never went searching for answers. She was afraid of what she might find. What if he belonged to someone cruel, someone who didn't deserve to have him back? What if they came to take him away? The thought made her chest tighten, panic flaring as she looked at him, curled so trustingly in her lap. She couldn't lose him. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. But the question of where he came from haunted her, lingering in the back of her mind even as she tried to ignore it. And then one evening, she found her answer. She was brushing his fur, her fingers working gently through the tangles as he lay stretched out on the couch, his eyes half closed in drowsy contentment. It was the most relaxed she had ever seen him, his body soft and warm beneath her hand. She smiled, her heart swelling as his tail gave a slow, lazy wag. But then her fingers brushed something hard beneath his fur, a rough patch on his neck. Frowning, she parted the hair, her eyes widening as she saw the worn, tattered remains of a collar, its edges frayed and dirty. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned the tag over, her heart pounding as she read the faded letters etched into the metal. "Ranger, if found, please call Daniel." There was a number listed beneath the name, but it was scratched and faded, impossible to read. Emily's hands shook as she stared at the tag, her mind racing as the pieces began to fall into place. He wasn't just a stray. He had belonged to someone who had named him, who had loved him enough to give him a collar, an identity. But where was Daniel now? Why had he left Ranger behind? Her chest tightened as she looked at him, his eyes closed, his breathing soft and even as he slept, completely oblivious to the turmoil swirling inside her. She had to find out the truth. She owed him that much. But fear gripped her, cold and unrelenting as she imagined what she might discover. What if Daniel had abandoned him? What if he didn't want him back? Or worse, what if he did? Emily's heart ached as she looked at Ranger, her fingers brushing over his head as she whispered his name, her voice trembling. "Ranger, who are you?" His ears twitched at the sound of his name, his body shifting as he snuggled closer to her, his trust absolute and unwavering. Emily closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks as she cradled him in her arms, her heart breaking as she realized the choice she had to make. She had to find Daniel. She had to know if he was out there, waiting for the dog who had never stopped loving him. But she also knew that if Daniel wanted him back, if he had the right to take him, she would lose him. She would have to say goodbye. The thought was unbearable, and Emily's chest tightened as she clung to Ranger, her tears falling silently into his fur. But she couldn't let her fear keep her from doing what was right. Ranger deserved to know where he came from, to find the person he had waited so long for. And if it meant breaking her own heart, then she would do it, because she loved him enough to let him go, even if it destroyed her, even if it left her standing alone in the rain, watching him walk away. "I'll find him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll find Daniel, even if it means losing you." And as Ranger slept peacefully in her arms, Emily made a silent promise to the dog who had saved her heart without even trying. She would give him the life he deserved, even if she wasn't the one who got to share it with him. The air was crisp and cold, the morning sun casting long shadows across the quiet street as Emily stood outside the small, weathered house, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She stared at the chipped red door, its paint peeling from years of neglect, her fingers trembling as she tightened her grip on the leash. Ranger sat at her side, his body tense, his ears perked as he watched the house with wide, hopeful eyes. His tail twitched, a faint whimper escaping his throat as his gaze remained fixed on the door, his body leaning forward as if he was ready to run to it. Emily's chest tightened, her throat burning as she looked down at him, her heart breaking at the pure, unguarded love she saw in his face. He remembered this place. He remembered who waited for him inside. She had been searching for weeks, calling every number she could find, knocking on doors, following every lead until it had finally brought her here. To the house where Ranger had waited, alone and abandoned, for so long. To the place where his story had begun. Emily closed her eyes, her breath fogging in the cold air as she fought to steady herself, her emotions swirling in a chaotic storm of hope and fear. She knew what she had to do, knew that this was the moment she had been dreading since the day she found his name on that old tattered collar. She had to let him go. Her chest tightened, pain slicing through her heart as she looked down at Ranger, his eyes bright and shining as he stared at the door, his tail wagging slowly. He was so happy, so filled with hope. He had never stopped believing that Daniel would come back for him, never stopped loving the man who had left him behind, and she couldn't take that away from him. She couldn't be the reason his heart broke. "Okay, go see him," she whispered, her voice cracking as she unhooked the leash, her fingers trembling as she released him. Ranger's head snapped up, his eyes locking on hers, his body quivering with anticipation as he waited, his loyalty unshakable even now. Emily's chest tightened, tears burning in her eyes as she forced herself to smile, her voice a broken whisper. "Go on. Go find him." The words were barely out of her mouth before Ranger bolted, his legs carrying him across the yard in a blur of golden fur, his tail a blur of excitement. He skidded to a stop in front of the door, his paws scratching at the wood as he barked, his voice high and frantic, filled with desperation and hope. "Daniel! Daniel!" Emily's heart shattered as she watched him, his entire body trembling with excitement, his eyes wide and bright as he called for the man he had waited so long for. She wrapped her arms around herself, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back the sobs that threatened to break free. This was the right thing to do. This was the life he was meant to have. But it was breaking her. It was tearing her apart to watch him run to someone else, to watch him leave her behind. The door opened slowly, a man stepping out onto the porch, his face pale and thin, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He leaned heavily on a cane, his body frail and weak as he looked down at the dog that was now bouncing at his feet, his tail wagging so fast it was a blur. "Ranger?" Daniel's voice was hoarse, cracking with disbelief as he sank to his knees, his cane clattering to the ground as his arms wrapped around Ranger's neck, his body shaking with sobs. "Oh, God! Ranger, I thought I lost you." Ranger's cries filled the air, his body pressing against Daniel's chest, his paws clawing at his shoulders as he tried to get closer, to wrap himself around the man he loved more than anything in the world. His tail never stopped wagging, his eyes shining with joy as he licked Daniel's face, his voice trembling with happiness as he whined and barked, his heart bursting with relief. Emily's knees buckled, her back hitting the side of her car as she sank to the ground, her hand clamped over her mouth as she watched the reunion, her vision blurred by tears. She had never seen him this happy. She had never heard him cry like that, his voice high and frantic as he whimpered and howled, his love pouring out of him like a flood. He hadn't given up. He had waited, faithfully and patiently, for the man he loved to come back, and now he was finally home. Daniel buried his face in Ranger's fur, his body trembling as he clung to him, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to leave you. I didn't want to. I was in the hospital. I was sick. I couldn't come back for you." Ranger's cries softened, his body curling around Daniel's as if trying to protect him, his head resting on his shoulder as he sighed, a deep, contented sound that broke Emily's heart all over again. He forgave him. Without hesitation, without question, he forgave the man who had left him behind. Emily's vision blurred, her chest tightening as she turned away, her body shaking with silent sobs. She wanted to be happy for him. She wanted to feel relief, to feel joy at seeing him reunited with the person he loved most. But all she could feel was pain, raw and unrelenting, as she realized that he was no longer hers. He had never been hers. He had always belonged to Daniel. A soft whimper made her look up, her breath catching as she saw Ranger standing in front of her, his eyes wide and confused as he nudged her hand, his body pressing against her leg. She let out a choked sob, her fingers curling into his fur as she buried her face in his neck, her tears soaking into his coat. "I love you, Ranger. I love you so much," she whispered, her voice breaking as she held him close. "I'm going to miss you, but this is where you belong." Ranger whined, his head tilting as he looked up at her, his eyes filled with concern and love. Her heart shattered, the pain so sharp it took her breath away. But she forced herself to smile, her fingers brushing over his head one last time. "Go on. Go be happy," she choked, her voice barely audible. "You deserve it." He hesitated, his body trembling as he looked back at Daniel, his heart torn. But then Daniel called his name, his voice cracking, and Ranger's ears perked, his tail wagging as he ran back to the man he had waited for, the man who was his entire world. Emily watched him go, her heart breaking as she realized that she had given him the greatest gift she could. She had given him back his family. And even though it hurt, even though it tore her apart, she wouldn't change a thing. Because she loved him enough to let him go. This heartfelt story reminds us of the incredible bond between humans and their pets. A bond built on loyalty, trust, and unconditional love. Ranger's journey teaches us about the power of hope and resilience, even in the face of abandonment and despair. It shows us that true love never gives up, and that sometimes letting go is the most selfless act of love we can offer. Emily's compassion and courage to do what was right, even at the cost of her own heartbreak, is a powerful reminder of the impact one act of kindness can have. This story isn't just about loss or reunion, it's about the healing power of love and the importance of never giving up on those who depend on us. Thank you for watching and sharing this emotional journey with us. If you were touched by this story, don't forget to like the video and share it with others who need a reminder of hope and love. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that celebrate the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. See you in the next video.